Eleanor Roosevelt, based on the biography by William J. Jacobs. Background: Eleanor Roosevelt was First Lady, or Wife of the President, from 1933 to 1945. She was born into a wealthy family, but she knew what it felt like to be an outsider. In this biography, you will learn how Eleanor helped people who suffered because they had lost jobs, had no money, and were treated unfairly. Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But she was more than just a president's wife. She was a sad and lonely child. People teased her about her looks and called her an ugly duckling. But Eleanor Roosevelt refused to give up. Instead, she devoted her life to helping others. Today, she is remembered as one of America's greatest women. Eleanor was born in New York City, where her family owned a house. They also owned a large house in the country, on the Hudson River. A servant took care of Eleanor when she was a child and taught her to speak French. Eleanor's mother was Anne Hall Roosevelt, a woman who wore expensive jewelry and fine clothing. Her father was Elliot Roosevelt. He had his own hunting lodge, and he liked to sail and to play tennis and polo. Elliot's older brother was Theodore Roosevelt. He became President of the United States in 1901. The Roosevelt family was one of America's oldest and wealthiest families. Almost from the day of Eleanor's birth, October 11th, 1884, people noticed that she was not a pretty child. Her mother and her relatives were beautiful, but Eleanor was plain-looking. When Eleanor was born, her parents had wanted a boy. She felt unwanted, and she became shy and withdrawn. She was a frightened, lonely little girl. The one joy in the early years of her life was her father. He used to dance with her, and he would throw her into the air while she laughed and laughed. He called her Little Goldenhair, or Darling Little Nell. In other words, Eleanor Roosevelt was born into a wealthy and important family, but she was not like the rest of her family. The other members of her family did not think she was beautiful, and she felt unwanted. Then, when she was 6, her father went to live at a medical center in Virginia. He had a drinking problem that he was trying to overcome. Eleanor missed him greatly. Next, her mother began to have painful headaches. Eleanor would sit for hours holding her mother's head in her lap and gently stroking her forehead. Nothing else seemed to take away the pain. Even at the age of 7, Eleanor was glad to be helping someone. The next year, when Eleanor was 8, her mother died. Soon after that, Eleanor's brother, Elliot, suddenly became ill, and he died too. Eleanor and her baby brother, Hall, were taken to live with their grandmother. A few months later, tragedy struck again. Eleanor's father died. Eleanor had lost her mother, a brother, and her father all within 18 months. Eleanor carried her father's letters with her for the rest of her life. In them, he had told her to be brave and to become well educated. He wrote that he hoped she would grow up into a woman he could be proud of, a woman who helped people who were suffering. The first few years after her father's death were very hard. For months, Eleanor pretended that he was still alive. She made him the hero of stories she wrote for school. Sometimes, alone and unhappy, she just cried. Some of her few moments of happiness came from visiting her uncle, Theodore Roosevelt. A visit with Uncle Ted meant playing games and running around outdoors with the many Roosevelt children. He often read old stories and poetry to the children, and Eleanor learned how much fun it was to read books aloud. Still, Eleanor was unhappy most of the time. Her grandmother was old and often confused. She didn't show Eleanor and her brother much love. In other words, Eleanor's childhood was filled with loss and sadness. Just before Eleanor turned 15, Grandmother Hall decided to send her to Allenswood, a girls' school in England. At school, Eleanor worked to toughen herself physically. She did not like team sports, but she played field hockey to improve her self-control. She played hard and won the respect of her teammates. Eleanor also learned to think for herself at Allenswood. She was growing up, and the joy of young womanhood was changing her personality. Eleanor left Allenswood just before she turned 18. Grandmother Hall made her go to dances and parties. She wanted Eleanor to take her place in the social world with other wealthy young women. Away from Allenswood, Eleanor began to worry about her looks again. The old teasing began again, especially from Uncle Ted's daughter, Princess Alice Roosevelt. As always, Eleanor did as she was told. She went to all of the parties and dances, but she also began working with poor children in New York. She took children to museums and to musical concerts. She tried to get their parents interested in politics. She wanted them to work for better schools and cleaner, safer streets. In other words, Eleanor went to a private school in England. There, she played sports and was liked by her teammates. Instead of finishing school in England, Eleanor returned home to take her place in the world of wealthy young women. She began to work with poor children in New York City. Eleanor's life reached a turning point when she fell in love with her fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. For a time, they met secretly. Then they went to parties together. Franklin saw Eleanor as a person he could trust. He knew that she would not try to dominate him. On March 17, 1905, Eleanor and Franklin were married. Uncle Ted, who was now President of the United States, took the place of Eleanor's father in the wedding. In May 1906, Eleanor gave birth to their first child. During the next 9 years, Eleanor and Franklin had 5 more children, one of whom died as a baby. Eleanor was still shy and afraid of making mistakes, but she was so busy that she didn't spend time thinking about it. Before long, Eleanor and Franklin began to have problems with their marriage. She was serious and shy, and he enjoyed light talk and flirting with women. Instead of losing her temper, Eleanor hid her anger. She did not talk to Franklin at all. Faced with her brooding silence, he only grew angrier and more distant. In other words, Eleanor fell in love with her fifth cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. They married and had 6 children, but one died as a baby. They had problems with their marriage, and Eleanor showed her unhappiness by not talking to Franklin. Meanwhile, Franklin's career in politics grew quickly. In 1910, he was elected to the New York State Senate. In 1913, President Wilson appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and the Roosevelt family moved to Washington, D.C. In 1917, the United States entered World War I. Like many socially prominent women, Eleanor helped with the war effort. Sometimes she worked 15 or 16 hours a day. She made sandwiches for soldiers who passed through the nation's capital, and she knitted sweaters. In 1920, the Democratic Party chose Franklin as its candidate for Vice President of the United States. His party lost the election, but he became a well-known figure in national politics. In the summer of 1921, disaster struck the Roosevelt family. Franklin fell ill with polio, a disease that used to kill or cripple thousands of children and many adults each year. Franklin lived, but he lost feeling in his legs and could not use them. He had to be lifted and carried from place to place. He had to wear heavy steel braces from his waist to the heels of his shoes. Many people told him to give up politics, but this time Eleanor stood up for her ideas. She argued that he should not be treated like a sick person, that he should not be treated like someone waiting to die. Franklin agreed. He slowly recovered his health and his energy returned. In 1928, he was elected governor of New York. 4 years later, he was elected President of the United States. In other words, Franklin was elected a state senator. Later, he was given a position in the national government. Then, he became ill and lost the use of his legs. Eleanor changed during Franklin's illness. To keep him in the public eye, she became involved in politics herself. She made many speeches to raise money for the Democratic Party. Then, after becoming interested in the problems of working women, she gave time to the Women's Trade Union League, or the WTUL. Through the WTUL, Eleanor met a group of remarkable women doing exciting work that made a difference in the world. They taught her about life in poor areas. She hoped that she could do something to help poor people. Instead of staying with her wealthy friends alone, she joined people working for social change. When Franklin was sworn in as president, the nation was facing its deepest depression. The United States was in trouble. 1 out of every 4 Americans was out of work, and people were losing hope. People stood in lines in front of soup kitchens for something to eat. Mrs. Roosevelt knew of once wealthy families who were forced to eat stale bread from thrift shops or to go from house to house begging for money. Eleanor served soup in the kitchens. She traveled across the country learning about the suffering of coal miners, shipyard workers, migrant farm workers, students, and housewives. Travel was hard for Franklin because of his illness. So, she became his eyes and ears. She told him of what the American people were really thinking and feeling. Eleanor also urged Franklin to support laws that would create social change. One such law was the National Youth Administration, the NYA. It provided money to help poor young people stay in school. Eleanor lectured widely, wrote a regular newspaper column, and spoke often on the radio. She fought for equal pay for women. Like no other First Lady before her, she became a link between the President and the American public. Eleanor fought for people who were treated unfairly. When she entered a hall where black people and white people were seated in separate sections, she made a point to sit with the black people. Her example was an important step in showing the nation that all people should be treated the same. In other words, after Franklin's illness, Eleanor became more active in politics. She worked to help poor people and people who were treated unfairly. On December 7th, 1941, military planes from Japan bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This event led to the United States to enter World War II. Eleanor again joined the war effort. She helped the Red Cross raise money and she gave blood. In addition, she visited American soldiers on islands throughout the South Pacific. When she visited a hospital, she stopped at every bed. To each soldier, she said something special, something that a mother might say. At first, the military leader, Admiral Nimitz, thought such visits would become a nuisance, an irritation. But he became one of her strongest admirers. Nobody else, he said, had done so much to help raise the spirits of the men. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe seemed near its end. Then, on April 12th, A phone call brought Eleanor the news that Franklin had died. After Franklin's funeral, Eleanor placed flowers on his grave every day that she was home. With Franklin dead, Eleanor Roosevelt might have dropped out of the public eye. Instead, she found new ways to live a useful, interesting life and to help others. Now, her successes were her own, not the result of being the president's wife. In December 1945, President Harry S. Truman asked her to go to London to begin the work of the United Nations. Truman said that the nation needed her. It was her duty. Eleanor agreed. Some people thought she wasn't qualified for the job, but she proved them wrong. Eleanor pushed for a ruling that would help war refugees. Fighting had forced them to leave their home countries during World War II. Now, some refugees did not want to return home. Eleanor thought that people should have the right not to return to their native lands if they did not wish to. In an emotional speech, she said, "We must consider first the rights of man and what makes men more free. Not governments, but man." Eleanor thought the United Nations should stand for personal freedom, the rights of people to free speech, freedom of religion, and human needs such as health care and education. In other words, during World War II, Eleanor again helped with the war effort. Then, just as the war was about to end, Franklin died. Eleanor did not drop out of politics. Instead, she agreed to help the United States in its work with the United Nations. At the United Nations, Eleanor continued to fight for human rights. Even after retiring from her work at the United Nations, Eleanor continued to travel. She dined with presidents and kings, but she also visited poor areas in India, factories in Yugoslavia, and farms in Lebanon and Israel. Everywhere she went, she met people who wanted to greet her. They wanted to touch her, to hug her, to kiss her. Eleanor's doctor told her to slow down, but that was hard for her. She continued to write her newspaper column and to appear on television. She still started work at 7:30 in the morning and often continued until well past midnight. Eventually, she was forced to stop some of her activities and spend more time at home. On November 7, 1962, at the age of 78, Eleanor died in her sleep. She was buried next to her husband. Aldi Stevenson, who represented the United States at the United Nations, remembered Eleanor as the First Lady of the World. As Stevenson said, she would rather light a candle than curse the darkness. In other words, Eleanor stayed active in her later years. She died in 1962 at the age of 78.